Hey everyone, this is Mauro from the Clarion project, and I'm here today with my good friend Erick Stakelbeck, who's doing a lot of good work right now with Christians United for Israel and the host of the Watchman on TBN right now, a very successful show that we urge everyone to check out. And Erick, thanks so much for giving us some of your time today.
Ryan, great to be with you as always.
Great. So I want to talk to you a bit about Israel, which I know is probably the biggest passion of yours right now, and you're also a national security expert. So bringing that all together, we know the political climate in the United States right now is to not be as involved in foreign affairs as much. And so I'm hearing increasingly people saying, yes, I support Israel, I want it to exist, but do I really want to be spending my taxpayer money allying with them? Shouldn't they just take care of things on their own? So can you explain to us how it benefits the average American, their own safety, their own well-being, to support Israel beyond just saying they're the only democracy in the Middle East or any type of religious or moral obligation to support them? How does this help the average American to support Israel?
Well, Ryan, great question. I consider Israel the first line of defense for America, for the West. Think about it. This tiny nation, the size of the state of New Jersey, literally in the belly of the beast, in the center of the world's most chaotic region, the Middle East, they are literally holding back the wolves, whether it's Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, ISIS, Al-Qaeda. All of them are literally on Israel's doorstep. You call them the wolves of jihad or terror, whatever you want to call them. But Israel is on the front lines of that fight. Make no mistake about it, Ryan. If these evil forces, whether it's ISIS, the Iranian regime, Hezbollah, if they had their way and they wiped Israel off the map, which they talk about doing, which they intend to do, if they got their way and that happened, where would they come next? I personally don't believe, based on studying their ideology, studying their statements, I personally don't believe that they would kind of pack up their bags, go home and say, our work is done here. The Zionist entity has been pushed into the sea. Now we're done. They're coming to the West next. That's the ultimate goal. There's a reason that the Iranian regime calls Israel the little Satan, but they refer to America as the great Satan. That is not by coincidence. Ryan, there's a reason that when there are military parades in Tehran, that the Revolutionary Guards Corps and the Iranian military are stomping on Israeli and American flags side by side. For them, the little Satan and the great Satan are interchangeable. And Israel is standing on the front lines in an amazing way, fighting the good fight on every border against these forces that also want to destroy America. The bottom line is Israel's enemies are America's enemies. And just as we have an alliance with Europe, the democratic countries in Europe, we should have, and we share intelligence, military cooperation with them, we should have a similar relationship with a democratic, pro-American government and nation like Israel, which is in the middle of a sea of anti-American governments. To me, it's just common sense.
So what do you say to those that say, they may agree with you, but they say Israel is not the right battlefield, at least not now? That to them, they want Israel to survive, but if the jihadists were to get past Israel, or let's say Israel were to be extinguished, well, I'll worry about that then. Because we will hear this type of isolationist sentiment that will say, yes, Israel may be an ally of the United States, and I'd like to defend them, but I'm preoccupied with other things. If the threat from our common enemies were to grow to a certain level, I'll worry about it at that point. So what do you say about that type of argument for inaction, because people say the threat against the United States isn't high enough for them to be worried about what goes on with Israel?
I'd say it's incredibly short-sighted, number one, and it's kind of disheartening to me, Ryan, to think about how history repeats itself. I feel like we're in an era right now and a period of history that's very similar to the 1930s, where you had one beacon of truth, Winston Churchill, one of my heroes, who saw the gathering storm. He saw the threat of Nazi Germany rising. He told it like it was. He pointed to it and said, this is an existential threat. Bad things are coming. We have too few leaders and too few voices today who are saying that, who can see the forest from the trees and see the threat that the Iranian regime poses. Look, this is not alarmism. It's not sensationalism. The Iranian regime continues to attempt to develop nuclear weapons. Not only that, from an American perspective, Ryan, we're talking about why Americans should care about Israel. That's the bottom line, right? Why should Americans care about what happens over there thousands of miles away? Think about this. The Iranian regime right now, according to our own Pentagon, is working on intercontinental ballistic missiles. That's ICBMs. Now, you and I both know, Ryan, you only develop ICBMs for one reason and one reason only. to mount them with a nuclear warhead. They do exactly what their name says. They travel across continents. Now, why would the Iranian regime want to do that? Look, they already have missiles that can reach all of the Middle East, the Saudis, Israel, some of Europe. Why do they want missiles that can travel across oceans, across continents? It's really simple. The target of those ICBMs are not Saudi Arabia, they're not even Israel. The target is the great Satan, the United States. That's why they're doing it. Look, are they there in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? Can we kick the can down the road? I don't believe we should. People tried to kick the can down the road with Hitler. In the 1920s, Mein Kampf was ignored and blown off by most European leaders. Winston Churchill in the 1930s, even the early 1940s, members of his own parliament were castigating him as an extremist, an alarmist, and a warmonger. Churchill was right. And the voices warning about Iran today, I believe Prime Minister Netanyahu is very correct. I believe President Trump is very correct in warning about the rising threat of this Iranian regime, because Iran not only has their own devices, nuclear program, ballistic missiles, ICBMs, etc., they have extremely dangerous proxies, the most powerful of whom, Ryan, real quick, Hezbollah, which is a fully owned, operated and armed and funded subsidiary of the Iranian regime. They are a literal arm of the Iranian regime operating, ruling over southern Lebanon. Hezbollah has more American blood on its hands than any terror group other than Al-Qaeda. 1983, the U.S. Marine barracks bombing in Beirut, 243 brave American soldiers killed. That was Hezbollah. And by the way, even members of Congress like Peter King out of New York have said Hezbollah has a presence on Western soil in Europe and right here in the Western Hemisphere in our own backyard. This is a serious threat. And if we want to kick it down the road and say, well, that's Israel's problem, it doesn't concern me, tough break for Israel, but hey, we're comfortable here in America, I have another thing coming. There's another thing coming.
Now, more broadly, beyond just Israel, can you speak a little bit about the state of anti-Semitism, why it seems to be increasing, and why it's so important for us to give special attention to this type of hatred? Obviously, oppose hatred against people more broadly, but why is it that anti-Semitism in particular is rapidly increasing, it appears, and why it requires such strength from us in order to combat, even beyond the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that a lot of people try to boil it down to? Is there something broader that is generating this anti-Semitism that we face, and where does it lead if we don't stop it?
A few things. Number one, we've heard about the world's oldest profession. This is the world's oldest hatred, anti-Semitism. It goes back at least 3,500 years to the times of Pharaoh in Egypt. That's how old this is, Ryan. And the fascinating thing about, not fascinating, the troubling, disturbing thing about it is that every strain of radical can agree on this. Whether it's the far left, the neo-Nazi segment of the far right, jihadist, Islamist, whether it's the Iranian regime, whether it's the KKK, these different strains of radicalism can all agree on one thing. They hate the Jewish people and they hate the state of Israel. To me, that's pretty stunning, where they have different far left, far right, jihadi Islamists. They're obviously different theologically, ideologically, in some ways, all radical. But despite their vast differences in some areas, they can all agree on one thing. They are viciously anti-Semitic and they hate the Jewish people. To me, that says it all. It's an ancient hatred, number one. It's a prevalent hatred, number two, amongst varying ideologies. Number three, it's becoming mainstream. You know, Ryan, our team at Christians United for Israel, we consider ourselves kind of, from an American perspective, to be kind of the tip of the spear fighting against anti-Semitism. It's part of our calling and part of why we do what we do at CUFI. We support the state of Israel, yes, but the Jewish people around the world are under assault. I can give you some examples. Look, we've had obviously synagogue shootings right here in the U.S. Pittsburgh in October 2018, 11 people killed. San Diego, a 60-year-old woman killed just in April 2019. So we've seen anti-Semitic violence rising in the United States. Europe, of course, look, anti-Semitism caused some real carnage and genocide there not too long ago. It's rearing its ugly head once again on that continent. We've seen recently in a popular parade in Belgium, of all places, Ryan, kind of like a Mardi Gras in Belgium, I guess you would say, viciously anti-Semitic floats in this parade with caricatures of Orthodox Jews that looked like something out of a Nazi publication from the 1930s or 40s. The New York Times recently published a horrific anti-Semitic cartoon of President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, portraying Prime Minister Netanyahu as a dog with a Star of David around his neck. Again, this echoed Nazi, and I don't say that lightly, Nazi propaganda from the late 30s and early 40s. The New York Times had to apologize, as of this taping, twice already, and retract the cartoon. We have politicians, we're in Washington, D.C. right now, you and I, we have politicians on Capitol Hill. I think of most notoriously Ilhan Omar out of Minnesota, who make openly anti-Semitic statements, unashamed, not bashful about it at all. You have, in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn.
If I may, she will say that she's not being anti-Semitic. She's just talking about the Jewish or Zionist lobby. So could you respond to that when she tries to say, oh, I'm pushing these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, but that doesn't mean that I hate Jews? How would you tackle that?
I'm so glad you said that, because Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, head of the Labour Party there, one of the most powerful politicians in the UK, potentially a future prime minister there. I shudder to think that may happen. But it could happen. He says the same thing. I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist. Well, guess what? That's the new anti-Semitism today, Ryan, where the anti-Semites cloak their Jew hatred, and we just hate Israel. Well, you hate the Jewish state of Israel, number one. Number two, the BDS movement, boycott, divest from, and sanction. That's part of these so-called self-described anti-Zionists. They're big proponents of the BDS movement. What is BDS? It's the destruction of Israel by other means. Guns and bombs and terror have not worked, but maybe boycotts, maybe economic isolation, maybe diplomatic isolation at the UN and other international bodies, maybe that will work to squeeze the Jewish state and to weaken and harm and ultimately destroy the state of Israel. Same goal. The BDS folks, the BDS proponents, had the same exact goal as a jihadist. I know it sounds crazy.
Well, they have connections to them too, right?
And there's connections. Hamas, Muslim Brotherhood, there's been a lot of reporting on this. But at the end of the day, the techniques are different, but the end game is the same. The destruction of the state of Israel. So you can cloak it and you're just anti-Zionist, but if you want to see the destruction and you don't recognize the existence of the ancestral ancient homeland of the Jewish people, where they have a thriving democracy, where there are Arab members of the Knesset, where Arab Israelis have the right to vote, where Arab Israelis worship freely in churches in Nazareth, in other places. If you want to destroy that nation, and that's where the end game is, of just the anti-Zionist, then I'm sorry, you're an anti-Semite.
So one of the big debates that's going on, and this will be the last question, that you'll see being heavily politicized is whether we should focus on left-wing extremism or right-wing extremism, jihadism or white supremacism, but as you pointed out, they all have a commonality, which is Jew hatred. Yeah. So would you agree with the argument that a core pillar of our anti-extremism strategy, the ideological warfare strategy, should focus on combating anti-Semitism instead of arguing about which threat is worse? Yeah. Doesn't it make sense to attack anti-Semitism, because when you make progress on that front, you make progress against all the extreme ideologies at once? Would you agree with that?
Ryan, makes total sense. All these various strains of extremism, again, share this one pillar, and it's a central pillar of their ideologies, anti-Semitism and Jew hatred. So to me, wherever you see Jew hatred rear its head, under that nasty rock, you will find an extremist ideology that should be rooted out. It's a commonality, as you said. So absolutely, when we see, and it's becoming mainstream today, even politicians are espousing these views. Wherever we see it, it needs to be snuffed out, because it only leads to nasty things. You know, I was recently at Auschwitz and Treblinka, two death camps in Poland, Nazi death camps. I was with a 90-year-old Holocaust survivor named Irving Roth, an amazing guy, but he made a key point to me, Ryan, that really resonated with me. I've thought about it a lot since I returned from Poland. And he was at Auschwitz, and we were at Auschwitz discussing this. He said it started with words. It didn't start with gas chambers and ovens and mass shootings, which it went to eventually in the genocide of 6 million Jews. But it all started with words. It started with cartoons, caricatures in German newspapers and magazines. It started with vicious op-eds. It started with flyers posted around German towns by the Nazi Party, caricaturing Jews, slandering Jews. it all started with words. It started with propagandists like Joseph Goebbels calling the Jews subhumans, calling them vermin. And according to this Holocaust survivor, and I believe he's very right, it came to the point where the German people were led to believe that Jewish people were subhuman. So it was literally at the point in the death camps where an SS guard could slaughter Jewish children and then go home later that night and play with his own children in his own home. It's a sick, evil thing. But that's where it started. It started with words and demonization. And by the way, Ryan, we talk about BDS boycotting Israel, boycotting the Jewish people. I would argue the first boycott started in Germany under the Nuremberg laws, where Hitler banned all business for the Jews, yellow badges. They were isolated, they were stigmatized, and that led to Kristallnacht, the notorious night in 1938 where Jewish businesses were burnt to the ground, windows were smashed, synagogues were burnt, and Jews were killed. That's where it eventually leads. When you demonize and dehumanize a people consistently over a period of years, it leads nowhere good. It leads to genocidal violence. History has borne that out time and time again when it comes to the Jewish people.
Well, I know I said that would be the last question, but I've got one more for you. So I've got to ask, if anti-Semitism is so prevalent, yet it's so illogical, it's so evil, it's so wicked, how can you reach people who already have anti-Semitic beliefs? Is it possible to even change them when they're so far out there?
Ryan, I think it depends on the level you're at. We have cases, documented cases of neo-Nazis, even jihadists, who have disavowed their former life and their former views, and now are actually friends of Israel and the Jewish people. Now, maybe they're kind of isolated cases, they're not too common, but I'm a guy who has hope that the truth will eventually break through, and hopefully free some people's minds and their hearts of this evil. Ryan, there's no gray areas when it comes to anti-Semitism. It's evil. At Christians United for Israel, obviously we're a Christian organization as well that loves the Jewish people. I believe there's a spiritual dimension to it as well, to be quite honest with you. In my view, in the view of Christians United for Israel, God has a very special role and a special place in his heart for the Jewish people and the nation of Israel. Usually if you hate God, you hate Israel. That's usually how it goes in my experience. So I do believe there's a spiritual dimension to it as well. God has blessed the Jewish people. It's his eternal, the beautiful land, the glorious land, they call it in the book of Daniel. So I think there's a spiritual dimension to it. But I think the main thing is education. I think a lot of it's ignorance. I work with someone at Kufi who's a former radical Muslim. He's now a Zionist, pro-Israel. And he really shared his story with me about how he was brainwashed from a young age. He grew up in the UK, raised in a very anti-Semitic home. Here's the key. We talk about education, Ryan. He visited Israel. It changed everything. At Kufi, we're doing educational work all the time where we're sending groups of millennials, campus students, pastors, the whole 9 yards, who might not know much about Israel or the Jewish people, and we're actually sending them to Israel. To me, that makes all the difference in the world. Half of the anti-Semites, most of the anti-Semites, I would argue, a great percentage of them, number one, have probably never even met a Jewish person.
Right.
Number two, have certainly not been to Israel.
Right.
So I think education, I think exposure is a total game changer. And I pray that that happens more and more, especially in these times we're living in where anti-Semitism is rising at alarming and violent rates. I'll do my part to get the word out, and I can assure you of that. And I know Kufi will as well. But that's what we need, education and relationship. If there's real relationship with the Jewish people, real relationship with Israel, you can't go to Israel. And it's a flourishing, diverse, vibrant democracy. In my mind, you can't go there and come back saying, this is an apartheid state which should be destroyed and boycotted. Any fair-minded, morally good person, I don't see how they could do that. So it's exposure to, relationship and education, hopefully can turn a great deal of these haters, I guess you would say, help them to literally see the light and the goodness of Israel and the Jewish people, and how they've been a blessing to the world.
Great. Eric, thanks so much for the work that you do, and thanks for giving some time to the Clarion Project.
Anytime.
I look forward to talking with you next time.
Sure. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks.
Appreciate it. It's great.